think we'll get started. It's just turned 9 a.m. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. I'm sure more people will join as we move through our first few minutes of the stakeholder meeting. So welcome, everybody, to CTI's Winter DSSG Stakeholder Meeting. And as many of you know, we have our series of DSSG meetings throughout the day, engaging with various clinicians and stakeholders in relation to development of their portfolios and an overview of the research that's going on across the various DSSGs. So just as an introduction, this morning's stakeholder meeting includes a presentation from Emer Fogarty on the opportunities for clinicians to engage with the Joint Clinical Assessment Subgroup of the EU Member State Coordination Group on Health Technology Assessment. That's quite a mouthful, but Emer will walk us through exactly what's involved, and really having participated in a European roundtable discussion on this several weeks ago, it really is genuinely a very exciting opportunity for our Irish clinicians to be involved at European level on some decisions around drug use once approved in Europe. So we will have that presentation shortly from Emer. And just as an introduction to where we're at and how we formed this panel discussion theme for this morning, as you may know, we've had a number of very successful meetings at both ASCO and ESMO, and CTI have identified an appetite among global pharma to present their pipelines to our DSSGs. So some examples of those who wish to present include Pfizer, of whom we have a representative on our panel discussion this morning, AstraZeneca, Daiichi Sankyo, and Novartis. And over the next few weeks or so, we will be linking with the various DSSG chairs to gauge interest and identify suitable timeframes to have these discussions. In tandem with that, we've also developed a number of new potential collaborative opportunities with a range of both biotech companies and other academic research organisations that up to now, we haven't actively had the opportunity to engage with. So that's quite an exciting development. And we have already started the process of linking our DSSG chairs into collaborative discussions, and we will continue to do so over the coming months. So I know everyone involved in DSSGs and our stakeholders are very keen to see our portfolios develop across our range of DSSGs in Ireland. And I have every confidence that everyone involved will engage as much as possible, both with the pipeline discussions and in turn with the collaborative discussions. So I'll stop there, take any questions on that, gauge if there's any immediate interest or if people have any feedback on that plan. Thank you. No, okay, don't see any hands up. Okay, well, look, in the interest of everybody's time, I think we will move on to our presentation. And just to flag, as many of you will know, following our presentation from Emer, we have a panel discussion with 3 industry experts around the challenges of opening and operating trials in Ireland. And our panelists for that will include Orlaith Gavan from Pfizer, Rose Kidd from ICON, and Gwynne Morley from IQVIA. But now to Emer Fogarty. So Emer is pharmacist by trade, and she's the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics, otherwise known, as we all know, as the NCPE, lead on methodology and guidance. And Emer is Ireland's representative on the JCA subgroup of the EU Health Technology Assessment Coordination Group. And she's also Ireland's representative on that overall EU HDA committee. So without further ado, Emer, I might hand over to you, and really looking forward to an engaging presentation and discussion around the opportunities for our clinicians here in Ireland.
Thanks so much, Anja. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to just start. I have some slides that I want to share with everyone this morning, so I will just get those underway. Can you all see those slides okay? Is that okay, Angela?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Emer.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So thanks again for this opportunity to speak to you all this morning. So as I'm sure many, if not all of you know, that the NCPE is the national body for health technology assessment in Ireland. And over the last few years, we've been part of a really exciting process of just evolving evidence for new drugs when they come to the market in Ireland. And that's the new process that I want to talk to you about this morning. So I thought it would be helpful just to very briefly outline the current process, so then we can slot in where the changes are going to come. So at the moment, when a new drug comes to market, that's on the back of an EMA assessment, which considers whether there's a broad favourable benefit risk balance for the drug. Following that, when the drug comes to market, the NCPE, as the national HTA body for drugs, does the health technology assessment that's requested by the HSE, and then makes a recommendation to the HSE, who then ultimately make the decision on reimbursement of the drug. So within that HTA process, the company will submit evidence to us. We will conduct what we call a comparative effectiveness analysis, cost-effective budget impact analysis. This is informed and supported by clinical opinion and ultimately leads to a recommendation on reimbursement, which is often contingent on price reductions. And the NCB also facilitate patient organisation submissions, which all then feed into that HSE decision. But I just want to draw attention to the writing in red, the comparative effectiveness analysis. So this is where the added therapeutic benefit of the drug is assessed relative to what's already being used to treat patients. And that can vary from country to country. And it also looks at specific outcomes that are relevant to patients, which may not always have been the focus of the EMA assessment. And also may pull out specific groups of patients. So the potential for this type of analysis to be duplicated unnecessarily across Europe has been identified as a particular problem in the EU. Sorry, there's a little bit of interference coming through from I don't know, can other people hear that?
Angela, can you just go on mute? Oh yeah, she's on mute now.
Thank you. Thanks a million. Sorry. Okay, so yeah, this issue of unnecessary duplication of this comparative effectiveness analysis has been identified as a problem by the EU, given that this type of information is broadly transferable across countries, give or take a few nuances. So with this in mind, the HTA regulation was passed in 2021, which established a coordination group which is made up of representative bodies from all 27 member states, including ourselves. And there are two main aspects of the joint work that this coordination group is responsible for. Firstly, joint clinical assessments, which is the focus of my presentation this morning, but also joint scientific consultations. So the joint clinical assessments are these assessments of comparative effectiveness or added benefit, which happens just at the point where the drug gets the license. The joint scientific consultations actually is another really exciting part of this regulation, and that's where pharmaceutical companies can approach the coordination group for advice on their clinical development plans, so on their clinical trials at phase 1 or 2 or early phase 3, just to make sure that the evidence that they're generating is suitable not just for the EMA assessment but also for the HTA bodies who need related information for their access decisions. Okay, so going back to the schematic of the process and where this will all slot in. So in that blue section there where we have the EMA assessment, which happens right before the drug gets its license, we will now have a parallel process whereby the EU member states are engaged in this joint clinical assessment. So right at the point where the company applied to the EMA for their license, a JCA or a joint clinical assessment will automatically be triggered. So within weeks, and this is the really, really important point of the process for us as a country, within weeks, a PICO survey will be sent to all member states where we will be asked to define, well, what are the actual questions you want this JCA to address? We have this new drug. What are the treatments that you currently use that you need information on in order to assess how much better, how much safer this drug is compared to what you currently use? and on what particular outcomes do you need this information, and what is important? Where is the added value going to come from, on what particular outcome? So Ireland will get that PICO survey and we will respond to it, and this will then decide the scope of the assessment and the information that's going to be available in that JCA report. And the JCA report is published immediately after the license is granted. So right at the point in time where all member states are going to be deciding on whether added benefit has been demonstrated by this drug, that's when the JCA report will be available. And what the report will contain is very much a scientific analysis of relative effects. So we can expect to see hazard ratios, odds ratios, relative risks, differences, together with an extension on the strengths and limitations of the evidence and the uncertainties. It won't include anything on overall added value. The point is that this is the evidence that each member state needs for themselves to conclude on what the added value is. And there is a legal mandate then on the HSE as the decision maker in Ireland to consider the contents of the JCA report when they are making their decision. Okay, so getting back to the PICO survey, so this, as I said, is the opportunity for every European country to specify what their needs are. And it's based on this PICO framework, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. It's the backbone of evidence-based research for effectiveness of drugs. And it's where we get to define what are the specific subgroups, so the subpopulations maybe that we're interested in. But particularly the comparator is the one where we expect the most variation to exist across Europe. So when we're responding to that PICO survey as the HTA body in Ireland, we will look to all those items listed in red there for information to guide us on what the most appropriate response should be. We look at national and international guidelines to see what is best practice. We look at previous assessments we've done in similar therapeutic areas to see if we've previously got clinical opinion, which is described to us what practice is in Ireland, because where there are lots of different treatment options, practice may vary across countries, but also even within our own country. So it's important to get a kind of a geographic representation of what we use in Ireland. And this, I suppose, is where the real value of clinical expertise comes in, and where the input of clinicians who are actively treating patients with this particular disease is of real value to this process. There is an additional more formal role for clinical experts and patient experts to be involved, and that's a much more hands-on involvement throughout the JCA process, and that is for experts who have more of a cross-border remit or responsibility within EU organisations, and they would be appointed to the specific JCA for a particular drug on a case-by-case basis. There is also opportunity for stakeholder organisations input throughout the process. Again, these are particular organisations that would have to be registered with the EU, and again, which have a broad EU remit, which many of your stakeholder organisations probably would feed into as umbrella organisations. Okay, so in a little bit more detail, when we respond to the PICO survey, when we're thinking about populations, we're thinking about the full therapeutic indication that's covered by the license, but also different subpopulations where we might reasonably expect the prognosis to differ across subgroups. So where we expect that different long-term outcomes might be expected, then it would be reasonable to expect that the relative benefit of treatment might also differ, and that's the kind of information then that we would like to see from these reports. When we're thinking about the comparator, as I've said, we really want to focus in on what is the current standard of care in Ireland, and this is not restricted to, say, licensed treatments. It can include unlicensed drugs, and indeed it's not limited to drugs. It could be like a best supportive care scenario, or a watch and wait, or even surgical interventions. This is just an illustrative example. So this is the licensed text for Lynparza, which is olaparib, which is licensed for BRCA positive, HER2 negative, high risk early breast cancer, previously treated with neoadjuvant or adjuvant chemotherapy. So the full population, just in summary, is as I've described, but we know from general knowledge of the area and research and studies that have been done that there are two very pertinent subpopulations to consider here, depending on positive or negative hormone receptor status. And the differences and the risk of recurrence and the long-term outcomes for these two subgroups make it really important that we have a robust assessment of what the benefit is going to be in those two different subgroups, so that we can really then capture the value of the treatment when it comes to the HTA. Because the comparative effectiveness component stands on its own and is of interest, but it also feeds into the economic evaluation. We look at cost effectiveness, but I mean, cost effectiveness, is never going to stand up unless something actually has added therapeutic benefit. And the magnitude of that benefit is directly correlated with value and cost effectiveness also. Okay, so this is just, again, the illustrative example of how this would work in practice. Instead of one population, we would have two, what we call PICOs, separated by hormone receptor status. The intervention would be olaparib on a background of endocrine therapy for our first subpopulation, and then the comparators then would differ. We'd have a watch and wait scenario on a background of endocrine therapy for the hormone receptor positive population, and without that background therapy for the hormone receptor negative population. Now this is straightforward, and I guess if we were to get a PICO survey for this indication, given that we've done so many assessments in this area and there is there is so much evidence for this, for the natural history, I suppose, of this particular population, that we would have a firm understanding of where we might expect those different effects to lie. But it could be that a license will be applied for a drug in a brand new therapeutic area, not necessarily a therapeutic area, but a particular, maybe a particular target mutation, or even in an area that hasn't had any other treatments available yet. So those are the situations where clinical experts involved in the direct treatment of patients affected by the disease is of really most value. Okay. When it comes to specifying the outcomes that we want from these JCA reports, we'll be focusing on those that can demonstrate patient relevant benefits. So we will consider that a drug should either prolong life or improve life. So in that context, we look at overall survival, we look at quality of life and adverse events. Okay, so to wrap up, I know you have a full schedule, and it would be nice if we've some time for questions. We really hope that JCA will support HTA in Ireland. We will now have a really high scientific quality report at the time of license, and heretofore we would have had to wait until the HTA process unfolds in Ireland, and we would have to take the evidence from the company and assess it and go back and ask more questions. That all takes a lot of time. It's very resource intensive. That will all be done now and available at the time that the company gets their license. So it should reduce the workload and time frame for our national HTA. It will hopefully support HSE decisions. So again, they'll have timely and consistent information on which to base their decisions, and hopefully they should have a better way now to distinguish between those treatments that provide like a significant degree of added benefit compared to each other. Okay, it also will support companies, we hope, by reducing the duplication of their efforts across Europe. Now they'll just have to submit that evidence once to the coordination group. And this should hopefully reduce workload nationally and reduce any barriers that there are towards actually making that application for reimbursement in Ireland. And then also we really think that this is going to be a support to clinicians and patients. So this type of information isn't just useful for HTA and for decisions. Like it's really relevant for everyone involved in patient care to know, well, how well does this actually work compared to what we have already, and again in those outcomes that are really of importance. And these reports will be transparent, they'll be readily accessible to the public. And then the very last point that I want to make is about that other pillar of joint work, the joint scientific consultations, because this is another opportunity for clinicians to get involved. So as I said, at any stage during the clinical development plans that a company has for their drug, they can approach the coordination group for advice. And this is a formalised process where there are meetings and the companies submit questions and formal responses are given. So we're hoping that this process will really, in the medium to long term, lead to improvements in the general evidence base that we have available to us at the time that a drug comes to market in order to determine really what is the full added benefit. Okay, so if there are any questions, and if you agree, that's okay that we could take them.
That's wonderful, Emer. That was a real whistle-stop tour of the
Yeah, sorry if I went a bit fast.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you. I think it's very clear. I think it certainly represents a change of direction. You know, it would appear that it will have some very positive knock-on effects, which is excellent. So I'm sure there's a number of questions, just maybe while people are thinking of their questions. I know Evelyn has one already. Just in terms of the next steps then, specifically for clinicians and particularly for patient experts, what do you recommend at this stage? I mean, my understanding is that this change is due to take place from, you know, January of next year. It's been a number of years in the planning and in the pipeline around development of this new system. But what are the immediate next steps that, you know, our clinicians and patient experts in Ireland need to take, and how can they actually progress that?
Yeah, so at the moment, we still have very little visibility on when the first product is actually going to be submitted. So, you know, it's kind of been illuminating to me that the EMA don't even know exactly when submissions are going to come. So companies have to submit a letter of intent 6 months in advance, but not all of them do. And even when they do, the date that is intended that their application is going to go to the EMA, you know, often changes. So we're expecting to receive the first application, which will then trigger the JCA, you know, at some stage in January or maybe February. And I suppose starting with the patient input, because these PICO surveys are expected to take, we're only expected to be given a couple of weeks to deliver our responses. There are tight timelines associated with the JCAs. So we would hope to nearly develop kind of a default set of outcomes for what we expect is relevant across all of the spectrum of cancer indications. So again, looking at overall survival, specific quality of life outcomes for the different cancer types and generic quality of life outcomes. So we're hoping to have that done by January and to engage then with organizations in a more general sense as opposed to specifically per JCA, because even in our current process, we're very active in trying to get patient organizations to make submissions in order to support the HSE decisions, but we're also aware that a lot, if not most, organizations don't have the resources to put into every single HTA that goes on. And again, given the tight timelines, we don't expect it to be feasible for that input to happen on a case-by-case basis for JCA. So from the outcome side of things, that's going to be more general input. And then for the clinical expert engagement, so I was talking with ISMO yesterday and we were thinking of various ideas that might work. So at the moment, for our clinical opinion in the national context, we go out, we have a network of colleagues that we approach, and again, you know, depending on who has time and when they have time, we get that opinion from them. The difference with this particular process is that the questions that are asked are very specific, very concise. It's really two questions. What is the standard of care in your practice? Are there any subgroups of patients that you expect are going to respond differently? So whether that is, again, establishing that communications with the network as we currently do, what I would hope is that, you know, before January, we would continue this engagement to make sure, firstly, that people are aware, and then hopefully engage with the various, I guess, umbrella type groups, be that the DSSGs and the various networks of interest in particular cancer types and disease areas, that we can move it forward to see how best we can get that input, again, on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, that's wonderful, Emer. Evelyn, you give you a question there.
I had kind of a similar question to you, Angela. Great minds, you know, and all that around the patient involvement. And I'm afraid I'm around too long, Emer, because I was one of those patients that engaged a lot with the NCPE over the years in a previous role. And one of the things that happens with health technology assessments, it's actually not the assessment that slowed us down, it was the decision after it. And I suppose and that often takes a long time. What I'm curious to know is, what's the quality? Like, if we're doing this at a European level, is the quality, and when you're doing the health technology assessment, is it agreed at a European level, or is it set differently for Ireland? I was concerned about the patient involvement because I'm not seeing that, and if it's patient involvement at a European level, it's not local. And then I suppose the other question I have is, will that decision, so what happens after the health technology assessment, even if it's approved by NCPE and it's always put up on the website and it's always very transparent, it could be 2 years after that before a decision's made on whether the drug is accessible or not. So, or it could be 3, it could be 4. And so I'm just, is that process going to change? Because I think that's the process that we're all really interested in as well. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I'll begin at the end. I'm less likely to forget the most recent question. So yeah, I completely appreciate that this is where the delays and perhaps the lack of transparency is, it's beyond the HTA process.
Emer, you just put yourself on hold.
Yeah, have we lost Emer? Is our connection okay?
Sorry, my microphone came undone. Can you hear me now?
You're back.
Yes.
Okay. Just at the point of the hard question. No, there is, so within the regulation, as I said, there is a legal mandate for the HSE to give due consideration. Now that's a vague enough mandate. However, there is also a mandate for individual countries to report within 2 years on how they have implemented the outputs of the JCA within their own process. So within that is an implicit responsibility actually to do something meaningful with the results of these JCA reports, in addition to responding to say how useful that our country has found them in the first place. And the JCAs are not going to be useful if they're not used in a timely way. The clinical evidence supporting many new drugs is rapidly evolving. So at the point of licensing, there's a certain amount of evidence available. Within a year or 2 years or 3 years, as you say, there might be many more sources of evidence. And when a country is making a decision on the therapeutic added value of a drug, they are obliged to include all the available evidence and all the most up-to-date evidence. So firstly, if we don't get an application from a company for reimbursement, within a couple of months of the license, it's likely that the information is going to be out of date and the JCAs aren't going to be useful. If, as a HTA body, the NCPE, if we're not ready to assess these drugs in a timely way once the application comes, the information is going to be out of date. And equally, if the decision doesn't follow on in a timely way, there's also a risk that the JCA is going to be out of date. So this will all unfold, within the first couple of years, and will be clear when we need to report back to the EU. How have we done in using this new evidence that's available to us? Your question about the QALY. So I guess the QALY is part of the cost effectiveness analysis. So it's a downstream consequence of comparative effectiveness. So indirectly, these comparative effectiveness results will be feeding into the QALYs. And then the patient involvement. Yes, you're right. The official patient involvement, so that this patient expert, there is a role for a patient expert. That would be someone who probably is involved at an EU level with different umbrella organisations, but I guess that could be someone within the Irish organisation who feeds up into that. There is a network of organisations which some of you may be familiar with, it's called the Stakeholder Network, and it is so the EU, twice a year, the EU Commission put out a call for EU organisations to join that stakeholder network. And so more information on patient involvement will be available through that network.
Thank you. Siobhan, question there for you, Mark. I think Siobhan might be frozen. Siobhan, you have a question there? You're just on mute. Yeah.
Sorry, haven't. Sorry.
So I can't hear you, Siobhan.
Sorry,
You're back on mute,
again.
Siobhan.
There you are.
Yeah, that's it.
No.
Sorry, apologies. I'm having problems as well. Sorry, very quickly. First of all, I thank you very much. I'm going to focus on advanced cancer as a particular area, and in particular, you know, what I'm seeing, which is fantastic, is some kind of coordination of the HTAs, which is very to be welcomed, absolutely. But what I'm not hearing is, you know, will this speed up the process of getting patients access to drugs in a timely manner? Because at the moment, as you know, there's a big issue with timing and hearing from EMA license to, you know, actually having it available in the public system, obviously pending approval of the HTA process. But what I'm not hearing is that this is going to make it quicker, because at the moment it's simply way too long, particularly for advanced cancers. That's my first question, is timing. Second question is, in terms of some of your parameters, in particular again for advanced cancer, you know, overall survival is a tricky one in advanced cancer. And in particular with, you know, innovations which tend to happen in the advanced cancer space first, like with new biomarkers, etc., you would not have overall survival numbers. You know, we've also got issues with paucity of data with advanced cancers in terms of incidence and prevalence. So there's massive gaps in the advanced cancer evidence base. And then, you know, I'm hearing overall survival else in the meantime, particularly with new biomarkers coming through. That's my question. How will that be captured?
Okay, that very last part, I got the first couple of questions, but the question about the biomarkers, could you read that one again?
Yeah,
you cut out
just saying that, you know, the way the cancer is advancing in terms of, you know, the drug side of it, advanced cancer, there's obviously new biomarkers coming out, we're subdividing indications, that's the trend, okay? So in terms of the trend, what that implies, in general, cancer oncology drugs are tested first in advanced cancer patients, right? So the problem is that there's limited data.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is overall survival, you know, will that be a limitation, and what other parameters would be useful in the evidence in the absence of data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And depending, and those outcomes will vary depending on the disease, but also on the stage of the disease as well. So your advanced cancers as opposed to your adjuvant settings and your neoadjuvant settings, and in certain circumstances disease-free survival or event-free survival may be relevant. You know, that's not to say that the outcome that is actually irrelevant, and you know, clinicians and patients know this better than me, but you know, we're ultimately hoping that these do lead to an improvement in overall survival, or if not, an improvement in the length in terms of quality of life. And the problem we're seeing in a lot of the clinical trials that are coming now is that, you know, that quality of evidence is getting sparser and sparser, and there's definitely a paucity of evidence, but at the same time we're often seeing you know small clinical trials in very, very similar patient populations, like, you know, the lack of cohesion in, you know, in bringing patient cohorts together who could potentially reliably give better evidence for particular treatments and on their added value. What we also look at in comparative effectiveness is the validity of surrogates. So that would all be contained in this comparative effectiveness assessment. So if we don't have OS, and if we're using PFS or DFS or whatever it is, you know, there would have to be a robust assessment for how valid is that as a predictor of outcomes that we're really interested in. And again, for certain disease areas that may hold more valid than others. But there have been disappointing results and outcomes and publications which don't support that particular surrogacy. So these are all things that we're going to be looking at. And again, you're absolutely right about whether or not this is going to speed up access. And in the short term, you know, I can't say what I can't say in the medium or long term either, but going back to what I mentioned to Evelyn, you know, that responsibility that lies with the HSC to actually take these into consideration in a meaningful way. Certainly we expect that our HTA process, so the time it's going to take for us to assess the drug and come up with our recommendations, that information that goes to the HSC should get to them quicker.
Thanks, Emer. Thanks, Siobhan. Just time for one last question. Simon Walsh, waiting very patiently there. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Hi, Emer. Thanks for the talk. This is more an operational question, but given the clinician and cross-border appointment to the EU JCA, will we still be able to engage for clinical elicitations, advisory boards with our small pool of doctors in Ireland, or will we be notified if we can't engage with one doctor because they might be appointed to the JCA?
Are you coming from the perspective of a pharmaceutical company?
Yes, so if we're submitting a rapid review or if we're submitting a HTA, we would do obviously clinical elicitations with doctors.
Yes.
Given that there might be a conflict of interest if they've been appointed to the JCA, will that become apparent to us early on that we can't engage with those doctors, or how will that work?
I would imagine that it would be not a huge concern. You know, what we're expecting in, say, 2025 is, say, between 15 and 20 cancer products. And the official EU clinical expert will be drawn from somewhere across the EU. You know, so maybe one per JCA, you know, taken from one of the 27 member states. So it's not a case that, you know, a lot of our clinicians are going to be pulled out. There are a lot of hurdles for official involvement as well. Like there are strict conflict of interest rules and confidentiality, in addition to probably a particularly intense draw on time. Now, again, that is going to happen in very definite pockets of time. So I guess it does remain to be seen what the resources for involvement as a clinical expert in an official EU capacity, you know, are actually going to entail. But I wouldn't see it as being like a major impact on the clinical expertise that you can engage with in Ireland.
Perfect. Okay, good to hear.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Emer. I think really interesting discussion. We could go on easily for at least another half an hour on this topic. I think, look, there is definitely potential there. We are all, as you know, so focused on trying to reduce the time to not only drug approval, but also, as Siobhan said, access to those drugs once approved. So hopefully this is a step in the right direction. We really appreciate all the work you're doing on our behalf, Emer, at EU level, and we wish you the best of luck with your work going forward. And I'm sure we will be hearing a lot more over the next weeks and months to come.
Thanks. So thanks very much, Angela. Thanks, everybody. Thanks also for your questions.
Okay, so we will move on now to our panel discussion. And as I said earlier, we're joined today by three industry experts to discuss the challenges around opening and operating trials in Ireland. So as a way of introduction, our panelists this morning are Orlaith Gavan, and Orlaith is Country Medical Director and Chief Medical Officer for Pfizer in Ireland. And like her co-panelists, she is an industry expert and she's been with Pfizer for over 18 years. Rose Kidd is President of Global Operations Delivery for ICON, and Rose has over 32 years of experience in industry. And finally, we have Gwynne Morley, who is General Manager with IQVIA Ireland. Gwynne, similar to Emer, is a pharmacy graduate originally, and as well as having extensive industry experience, Gwynne is a former Director of Heart and Vascular, Diabetes and Emergency Department at the Mater Private Hospital. So really great mix of experience and expertise on our panel. And just before we begin, as many of you are aware, Ireland currently lags behind other similar sized EU countries in relation not only to the number of cancer clinical trials that are open for accrual, but also with the overall percentage of cancer patients on interventional cancer clinical trials. We're currently in around 2%. As you will know, the target of 6% as outlined in the current cancer strategy. And CTI, on your behalf, is very focused on making every effort to increase access to trials for patients in Ireland. And in 2024, we made the issues of GDPR funding, operational efficiency, and clinician engagement our 4 strategic priorities, all with the collective aim of increasing the number of trials that we can bring into the country and reducing the overall time to first patient. Now, very timely for today, our CTI DSSG Winter Digest will be published today. I think Ken may have already pushed it out. Thank you, Ken. And that outlines many of the steps that have been taken across these priority areas with a lot more actions to come. So I'm really delighted today to have the opportunity to ask our panelists how industry views Ireland's position currently and to discuss any additional measures that we can take to make Ireland more attractive and to provide our audience then in turn with an opportunity to ask questions directly. So you're all very welcome. Thank you to our 3 panelists for joining us. Orla, I might start with yourself, and it's a 2-part question really.
Okay.
So firstly, thank you. Can you describe the process by which Pfizer Global chooses countries as cancer clinical trials destination? And then what steps do Pfizer Ireland take to try to promote Ireland as a country of choice?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me okay, Angela? I hope I don't have any...
Indeed.
You can hear me. Perfect. So good morning, everyone. And thank you so much to Cancer Trials Ireland for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. So yeah, it's such a critical issue. I mean, from all our perspectives, I would say that, clinical trials are the cornerstone, as we all know, of evidence-based medicine. And it's really critical that all of us, all stakeholders, including us in industry, academia, that we work alongside and we work closely with the clinical community, really with the objective to ensure that Ireland is a preferred country for new clinical trials to be placed here. And I would say, from the Pfizer perspective, we have a very strong record in this space of attracting new clinical trials in, and it's really important that we all continue to build on this. So Pfizer Global, so, we know what they're looking for. If I was sitting, as a member of the research and development team at Pfizer Global, the types of things I would be looking at and what Pfizer Global are looking at, there's many elements that are taken into account when considering, a country to be included in a new Pfizer clinical trial opportunity. So what would they be? I would say the most important would be our country's infrastructure, and do we have the ability to recruit the patients within the time frame that is set for the trial? Pfizer will also be looking at our past performance. So how have we performed in similar studies, not just Pfizer studies, but more broadly, in terms of the number of patients that we have delivered against what we committed to. Metrics, these are the metrics that are really closely looked at. What else? Startup timelines are really critical, and we have made huge progress here. I would say we've a very open, the HPRA regulatory body, they're extremely open. They're turning around the approvals very, very quickly in line with the timelines set. And we also have now the new centralized ethics committee, which again is a hugely positive step. So Pfizer are looking at the metrics, how long it's going to take to get a trial through startup. And we know recently also that huge progress has been made with, the standard indemnity form for public hospitals. And I know Cancer Trials Ireland played a huge role here. So that's hugely positive. Other things that Pfizer Global that they'll be looking at, they will be aware of Minister Donnelly's new clinical trials oversight group, with the aim to double, the amount of clinical trials that are conducted here in Ireland. They'll be looking at that. And I would say, you know, the most important thing is our investigators, our research team. You know, we have such talent here in Ireland, and many of our healthcare professionals are recognised internationally, and this is really a huge strength for us. It makes, you know, our job at Pfizer very, very easy, because, you know, Pfizer Global are aware of this, and they are looking at it. So we have, you know, we're very lucky that we have a number of new Pfizer clinical trials right now that are going through the setup. We did have a gap for a few years without any clinical trials. So really looking forward to see, you know, the new process in action. So Angela, I hope I've answered the first part. So that's what Pfizer Global really are looking at. In terms of what we do at a local level, so I would say a huge part of my role as country medical director for Pfizer Ireland is really to continue to promote Ireland within Pfizer as being a really important destination for new, you know, Pfizer clinical trials to be placed here. You know, not just in oncology, but I'm working across all the different therapy areas. Oncology, though, it has to be said, is a huge focus for us here at Pfizer, particularly given our recent acquisition of Seagen and their new antibody drug conjugate technology. So really what we do at Pfizer, and we have a really talented medical affairs team in-house, we're very, very lucky. It's really about understanding where the research gaps are in Ireland, you know, where and how Pfizer can address it. So we would work very, very closely with your fantastic team at Cancer Trials Ireland and all of the oncologists to really drill down and really understand where the research gaps are. And we, you know, as I said, we have a fantastic medical affairs team who are out and they're in regular contact with all the cancer centres in Ireland. And, you know, the medical team know the Pfizer pipeline, they know what the trials that are coming. And then the next step, you know, really begins. We start to pitch for those studies within, you know, Pfizer. And there's a huge amount of competition because we're not just competing against other pharmaceutical companies, we're actually competing within Pfizer. So if there's only 10 countries where a trial can be placed, then Pfizer Ireland are lobbying against Pfizer Portugal and Pfizer Belgium. So we need to be really, really, really sharp here. So how we do it is we network, we lobby internally, we showcase Ireland, we showcase our achievements, our successes, and how Ireland can really significantly contribute to a particular trial. You know, quite often we link in with our Irish investigators, we link them in with the Pfizer research and development team. This is so powerful. And we recently had a really exciting meeting at ASCO in June this year. And I know, you know, Cancer Trials Ireland were with us at that meeting, whereby we brought together a group of Irish oncologists and we sat down with really senior leaders from the Pfizer research and development team, and we pitched Ireland, we pitched our capability and what we can do. And only this week, another example, Angela and Ev, is, you know, I brought in a senior leader from Pfizer to meet you two in Cancer Trials Ireland, which was hugely powerful because that's putting Cancer Trials Ireland and your capability on Pfizer's, you know, agenda. So I think that's really key. It's showcasing what we have here, setting out our stall, showing strong collaborations that do exist between Cancer Trials Ireland and also other European and global research teams. This has been transformative and this is key. You know, but, you know, bearing all this in mind, you know, I would say, and my final point would be, this is all only possible if we do have a very strong track record of delivery in studies, of actually recruiting the patients that we commit to. But, you know, from a Pfizer perspective, I think it's all very positive. So I hope that gives you a sense of who we are and how we do it.
Certainly does, Orla, thank you. And of course, you know, to an extent, it is a little chicken and egg situation. We need to get those more studies in so that in turn we can prove that our processes are improving, our timelines are shrinking, and, you know, our accrual is performing in the way that we have in the past. So we genuinely really appreciate all the support at local level and everything that you're trying to do to promote Ireland. Thank you. So Rose, then, from the perspective of ICON, obviously huge global CRO, what are the top 3 issues, metrics, or concerns that your clients are raising when considering Ireland as a host country for trials?
Okay, thanks, Angela. And I guess I'll overlap a little bit about what Orla has said. I mean, it's a hugely competitive space. From an ICON perspective, we work across large pharma all the way to emerging biotech. But there's a consistent theme around country selection, and that is how quickly can you get your sites up and running. That means ethics, regs, and the contract negotiation, access to patients and patient retention. So it is all around timeline. It's about speed. And if we look at, I think we now have the advantage of being part of the EU CTR. So that places us in line with our European counterparts. So as it relates to ethics approval, regulatory approval, I think we're playing level field there. Where we still have work to do, and I'll be honest here, is around that contract negotiation. It is taking us, on average, about 5 months post the clinical trial approval to get some contracts negotiated, largely due to the, I guess, over-interpretation of the GDPR. We're seeing, I guess, multiple questions and a lot of, I would say, unnecessary demands being put on our customers around additional documentations. That is when we look at our European counterparts, we do not see this across other European countries in terms of the additional paperwork, really, and documents that need to be signed by our Irish sites. So I think that is, if I was to say any space that we can absolutely improve is once the EU CTR is submitted, start the contract negotiation immediately. Obviously, I'm involved in the government initiative where we are looking to have a national contract, very much like the UK ABPI, which is largely accepted by all of our customers. So if we can get ourselves to a place where we've got a national contract accepted by our customers, that will actually put us in a very competitive space. But what does play in our advantages is our PIs in Ireland know the patients. They are also the treating physicians. That's very powerful, not only from getting your patients into the trial, but patient retention is obviously also important, so that you can see that patient all the way through to the end of the trial. So top 3 metrics: getting your sites up fast, getting your patients in, and keeping your patients in the trial.
It's wonderful, Rose, and as many of you know, we've really tried to prioritise addressing that out of line interpretation of GDPR. We have a position paper that we published. We're feeding directly into yourselves within the National Clinical Trials Oversight Group, and we really do think for the first time that we will see improvements coming in 2025. And thanks genuinely to the huge work that you are all doing on that committee, on everybody's behalf, to try to negotiate that national contract and to really just cut through the over-interpretation in this country. Thank you very much, Rose. So Gwynne, then, as you've heard and everyone has heard on this panel discussion, GDPR and the challenges around its interpretation in Ireland have been central and are very central to this issue. But in IQVIA's experience, are there any other issues we have that make it challenging to open trials here?
I just said, actually, and I'll probably just pull together everything that Rose and Orla have just said. We've done a lot of research and analysis on this environment, on this area within IQVIA, and I just thought I'd share maybe the outputs from a couple of white papers that we've conducted and interviews, and just some of the stats surrounding it is 2021, the top 15 pharmaceutical companies based on revenue spent about 133 billion on R&D, and 44% of that actually was allocated to clinical trials. The 8 countries, like the cornerstone countries that they refer to, the US, EU4, UK, Japan and China hosted 60% of those clinical trials. But then actually, when you looked at the other European countries, they accounted for about 13% of global clinical trials. So there's different attributes of the countries that's making them very attractive for trials. So what we did was we interviewed, the head of global clinical trials operations within, the top European pharma companies. We also spoke to emerging biopharma and mid-sized European countries as well. And what we did was we identified these drivers for investment. And you can see it's basically what everybody's saying. It's the speed and quality, the expertise network, the regulatory network, but prevalence as well is very, very important from that point of view. Cost components did come up, but actually quality and speed will override that issue. And what they want is predictability of the forecasted timelines. And I think from our perspective, it's the trial performance, the speed, certainly not the quality. We've never had any issue with quality from an Irish site specifically, but also that kind of prevalence, the information on the population that's available is quite critical. So a more recent study that we've done is that we've looked at country infrastructure, clinical capabilities and patient availability that can look at the country trial readiness. And there's 17 metrics there that's highlighted. But then when you benchmark all the countries against each of those parameters, it's actually very different. And you can see that Western Europe, Switzerland, Denmark, Netherlands, they're the top 3 when it comes to operating infrastructure, clinical infrastructure. Then you start to see more of the Eastern and Central European countries. And obviously then on patient availability, it's obviously the larger markets, China, the US, that will override all that. But what we've seen with some of the sponsors that they've actually reduced the number of countries participating in clinical trials. And there's numerous factors for that. But actually what they would say is complexity of trial. But what we've seen within IQVIA is enrollment times have actually increased by 26 months. So we would feel with, geopolitical, health and environmental disruption, that is an opportunity now to diversify and actually, bring more countries into that. So I think it's an opportune time for Ireland to really demonstrate what it can do, because it's not about regulatory, it's not about our PIs, it's not about any of those. We need the metrics, but we also need to be able to demonstrate the prevalence. And you can see when you analyse countries by patient availability and the operational readiness, it really, highlights different markets. And really this was to focus on the next tier, an opportunity tier. And you see Ireland is there in the next tier of countries. It's really the patient availability that stops that. And what we would think is that if we could actually demonstrate, the patient availability, in particular, disease areas, therapy areas, that would actually enable Ireland to participate more in countries in clinical trials, but also that if we could develop more networks and strategic partnership agreements so that we're presenting ourselves as one while we're delivering on the metrics, I think we've got a huge opportunity here. So it was really just to share some of that data, and it really probably brings together all the views that both Orla and Rose have shared also today. So thank you.
Thanks, Gwynne. Very, very generous of you to share that. Lots of learnings in that for all involved. I had a lot of other questions, but I'm going to open it out in case our attendees have 1 or 2 burning questions.
I guess I just have a pitch. I have a pitch, Angela, and I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
So as I chair the subcommittee at the board level on GDPR and our position paper, which was just launched, and I want to thank a lot of you who fed into that on the panel, and it was really much, I think that's great, this collaboration that exists between Cancer Trials Ireland, the pharmaceutical companies, our patient consultants committee, but we haven't quite got into the minds of the decision makers in politics, and I would also say in the Department of Health, even though that committee is set up, and what I'd say is, how do we keep that drive going? So on Monday, Cancer Trials Ireland is facilitating a manifesto call to action for all the political parties. And what was really interesting is in some of the feedback is, some politicians and candidates were saying, well, we don't really know anything about cancer clinical trials, and there was a fear to even talk about it. We have, the main political parties are represented, and we're delighted. So what can we do in that space? Because they're the people that make the decisions on funding. You know, they're the people that make the decisions on changing the law to make things easier with regard to GDPR interpretation in our Irish sites and to get to the point where we have one contract. So I'd love to hear your views on that. And also anyone on this call can join the manifesto on Monday, either in person or online. So Ken and Claire are going to share that in the chat box.
I'll just give some of my opinions, Evelyn. Yeah, I think for me, it's about public awareness. If you look at public awareness in Ireland on clinical research and trials, very few people know about them. So I think it's still a bit of a taboo, let's be honest. So if you look at some of our European counterparts, and indeed if you can visit in the US, it's constant, it's constant in your face around trials and where you can go to access trials. So the best way to push anything is public pressure. We know that. We know that through back in the early 90s or 80s through HIV research. It was the patients that drove that. So I think if we can get to a position where the public is pushing this agenda, not just kind of industry, that in itself will drive an interest in government. But I will say thank you. I think you're leading the charge there, Evelyn. But small keys open big doors. I'm a big believer in that. We just need to keep chipping away at this.
Thank you.
Super. Yeah. Thanks, Rose. Thanks, Seamus. I think you have a question. I know, conscious we're just coming to the end now, but Seamus, if you just want to quickly.
So I'd like to thank Gwen for those slides. I mean, I think when you're talking to policymakers and that we live in the era of the soundbite and the tweet, and I think that data was very powerful about where we are, where we would like to be, especially when the countries that in the top tier are our neighbours, and where they also there's a very clear Lord O'Shaughnessy report about how we can get there. So there is a roadmap. So I just want to thank you for that. That was, I thought, in a couple of slides, just in terms of going back to Evelyn and Rose's point about interacting with stakeholders and politicians, those slides would be invaluable. And I think also I'm conscious that it's probably not the best day to be talking about vaccines with Robert Kennedy being appointed to the Department of Health. But we're all here today because of vaccinations and because of clinical trials. The COVID pandemic would have persisted like the Spanish flu for years without vaccination until people had died and then had gained immunity. So I think that's an important leverage in terms of the clinical trial community, in terms of emphasizing the benefits of clinical trials, because we've all taken part. We've all benefited from clinical trials in the last 3 to 4 years. Dramatically, our society has been transformed and opened up as a result. I think we need to leverage that more as clinicians in terms of emphasizing the benefits of that. Thank you. Great session this morning, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Seamus. Rob, I'll be generous. I'll give you the last word because we are just out of time.
You're very good, and I'll be very quick. I just wanted to pull together what everybody had said. Sitting on the clinical trials oversight group, it's become apparent to me this is not something that needs particular legislative change, or that it's around resourcing, it's around people coming together, it's around common sense, to be honest, being allowed to prevail. I think that's why the initiative from Cancer Trials Ireland has been so successful. And it beholds all of us to keep the momentum up. We have cabinet approval now with some of the initial recommendations, which will help in terms of the contractual thing. The next logjam we will hit will be manpower, because when we are successful, not if, we will need more people to be able to deliver that, and we need to keep the collective effort together. It is not, to me, it's not a legal thing. It is around the community coming together and sorting out these issues for our own community healthcare, what Seamus said, to give all of us the best opportunity for ourselves and our loved ones. And I think it is great the way we are all coming together and we're knocking down those silos to be able to do that. So that was just a comment, so not a question. Thanks very much, Angela.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to enter into discussion. Particular thanks to our Emer, who gave a wonderful presentation around the JCA, and obviously to our panelists, Orla, Rose and Gwen, and to everybody who took part this morning. We could go on for hours around this discussion, but we are a close-knit community and we're in touch regularly with each other along the way. So Thanks very much, everybody, for your support, and I hope you found this session useful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angela.